This week's question comes from Andrea, who asks, drug addiction, is it a choice or a disease? So I kind of watched a bunch of videos. I typed in drug addiction, choice or disease, and I watched a bunch of videos which all have kind of different theories. And so I kind of pieced together like a composite theory based on each of the individual theories that I found. And so what we're doing is blaming drug addiction on something. And I think the first and simplest way to blame drug addiction on something is, so I've loosely pieced together a theory of phases in which you can go about blaming drug addiction on this, that, and the other thing. So what I'm calling blame phase 1 would be, it's a choice. It's all the person's fault. This has its advantages and its disadvantages. So you look upon a drug addict and you say, what a horrible choices that person's making. They're wasting their lives and they're harming others by possibly becoming a criminal in order to obtain money. And they are just a really bad person. So the downside of this attitude is that if you act like that, then does it actually accomplish what you're trying to do? If you put all the blame on the person, saying that they're all making these choices, does that work? And sometimes, in a way, it does, because people do need to take as much responsibility for their actions as they are capable of. And your ability to increase your level of responsibility, your capacity for taking responsibility can increase with effort. And so if you're doing something bad and you realize it's bad, a really important part of changing it is choosing to change it, is actively being present to the idea that it's your choice. This is, I made a distinction between being a drug addict and choosing to take drugs. Because you can be a drug addict and have a craving for the drugs that you're addicted to, and you can still choose not to take them. So, originally when you chose to take the drugs and then you got addicted, well, that was a choice. But then the addiction I would say it could easily be considered not a choice. But every time you choose to take drugs, even if you're addicted, that is a choice. So it's kind of a subtle difference, all based on the idea that it's a choice. But when you blame everything on the person and saying that they are consciously making all of these choices badly, and therefore they are the one who should be punished, and they are the one who's causing all the problems, it doesn't always work. And sometimes you're blaming somebody beyond their ability to actually choose what to do, or their ability or desire to choose. Like, they may not want to choose anything else. And that's when you get into this idea of blame phase 2. It's a medical condition. We doctors only treat medical conditions. The point with a medical condition is that modern medicine has come up with an idea of what that is, and it has a procedure to treat things that it believes to be medical conditions. This is not as simplistic as you might think, because, like insurance companies, all sorts of funding is actually possible if doctors and professional people have a diagnosis, a specific name for, and it's a medical condition. So all of a sudden they can get money. So there's boatloads of cash because medical people are so powerful, and people don't really know how to actually deal with reality itself. They only deal with labels. And so this is true in the mental health world. But anyway, if you have a label for it, there might be money for it. And if you don't have a label for it, then it's not money. And if you're saying something's a choice, then you might not be able to get any funding to help deal with that person. Whereas if you say it's a medical condition, it's a disease, then people will think, oh, well, the person didn't make a choice. Well, I should be compassionate and give a lot of money to that. So it's only if it's objectively not of a person's choosing do people want to give money for it. Like insurance companies, donors. It's just weird. I don't fully understand it. But anyway, that is one advantage of calling addiction a medical condition. Other advantages is that there's definitely evidence that somebody who's an addict does have a... See, what is a disease? Any mental illness is not normal illness. Because mental illness has to do with the choices people make. It has to do with the thoughts they have and the choices they make. And it's believed that these diverge so far, in the case of a disorder or an illness, from what is good for the person. In other words, there's a conflict between what they're choosing and what either they or other people think is good for them. And that is what gets called mental illness. The result is that something that gets called mental illness then gets placed into the category of diseases, which doctors treat in physical patients. When you have a physical illness, a disease is something that for which you are never, no blame is put on the person. If there's cancer, if, or diabetes or whatever, nobody accuses them of choosing to create the cancer or the diabetes. So you have this idea of a disease which is involuntary. And when it's involuntary, it's so much easier to forgive the person for having it. And so you're in this atmosphere of all is welcome. You will always be forgiven. Since you didn't choose it, then we don't have to get angry at you, and we're not here to be taking our revenge on you. And so I think doctors, the people who call anything a mental illness, which is what drug addiction would be if it was a medical condition, they think they're being extremely compassionate, because no longer are we blaming the person for their choices and for their perceptions of reality. And there is mileage in blame phase 2, in it's a medical condition. You can accomplish certain things by approaching it from that perspective. But eventually, you do get kind of tired of that, because there's a feeling that something's missing here. One thing about diseases in the medical context is that they are always in one person. And a drug addiction could be one person behaving in a way that has something to do with the context of their whole society or their family, the people around them. And that's true with mental illness. Mental illness could be the result of a mixture of the person and their surroundings. So then I'm going on to blame phase 3. Now, these phases are loose. The order isn't precise anymore. At any rate, this is when you say, oh, it's a family problem. The family needs to solve it as a whole. There will be cases where one sibling is like the high achiever, and the other is the low achiever. And if they weren't siblings, and they weren't in those situations, the high achiever might not have been such a high achiever, and the low achiever might not have been such a low achiever. And so sometimes somebody's debauched behavior, such as being a drug addict, is actually related to their family dynamics. So that's a characteristic. Another way of blaming it is it's a society-wide problem. Things are bad at the small scale because society is bad at the large scale. I'll link to several videos that I've watched that all espouse these different theories that I'm talking about. One of them is that the demonstration that there was like huge heroin addiction in the Vietnam War, and they thought that when all these heroin addicts come back to the United States, they will continue to be addicts, and we'll have a nation of addicts on our hands. That's like the fear. And it turned out that didn't happen. The people who, vast majority of the people who came back who were on heroin stopped being on heroin when they came back. So, that proves that it was the social context that really fueled their addictions. There's kind of ups and downs with thinking of it as a society-wide problem. Because there are things that you can fix about society and things you can't fix about society. Which is kind of true of all the other blame phases that I'm talking about. There are things you can fix and things you can't fix. And if we can make society better, by whatever means, then obviously we should do that. But if we can't, and addiction is still a problem, then it's just part of the landscape, and there's really nothing we can do. So there's an element to which a certain percent of addictions are really truly due to the society. In other words, yeah, the world sucks, or wherever that person is at that time just sucks bad enough that their pre-existing weakness will drop below the threshold of resistance and succumb to drug addiction. Whereas if life were more meaningful and they had more to do, for example, or they were more loved, then they wouldn't have that problem. So that's basically the 4 blame phases that I was able to find. And so I conclude with this chart. Total pie ? I only included 4 causes here, and I used up 100% of the pie. But there might be a 5th or a 6th or a 7th cause that I didn't quite think of. But these are good enough, because if you deal with all these, then you're pretty much getting 98% of why people blame drug addiction on something. Remember, a medical condition may or may not be treatable. Just say, like, you have a person who's innately unable to be treated, even though they have a medical condition. So there's medical conditions that can be treatable or not treatable. And maybe, like, I just said maybe 20% of a drug addiction is best approached when you think of it as a medical condition. Over here you have a choice. I hesitantly said maybe 45%. Like, 45% of a drug addiction should probably be put on the person, because people have really enormous resources, and if you try to get them to find those personal resources that allow them to change their lives, I'd say they probably will. If it's a family problem, I put it 15%. I think, like, if you just had a different family, which you can't, but if you did, it's quite possible you'd be living a different life. And there's definitely an element in which a drug addiction could be an expression of a family problem as opposed to just a person's problem. And then here you have, it's a society-wide problem. I put that at 20%, because the rate of addiction changes based on the time and place in history that people are talking about. And, like, what is the treatment, so to say, if it's a society-wide problem? The treatment isn't to treat the individual, it's to somehow create a better society, if possible. And if not, then you just have to live with it. You have to just accept that there are going to be drug addicts in the society we have. There's an element that we just have to deal with that, too. That we just have to accept it. In fact, there's a huge element to which we just have to accept it. So there's your pie. This is my guesses. I don't know if it's 20% best treated as a medical condition. It varies from person to person. Maybe it works best if you treat it as a medical condition. What you really should be doing is adjusting the percentage of how you perceive it based on what works, what yields the best outcome, which is what everybody should be doing. And if you can think of a 5th or 6th or 7th cause for drug addiction, then, let me know. Because they should be part of the pie, too. Thanks for watching this week's episode of Frequently Zacked Questions. I am going to take Thanksgiving off. I'm taking the week off. But I should be back in 2 weeks. Or with another question. Keep them coming. Thank you.